And more recently, started crafting the so much. The eyes of the microscope. The agenda. Here by the largely agency. Don't have power walls. On the according to the state government. Any board members? Well, they were just one direction. Yeah, and then go off the line on stick and let's see. All right. So we can, Also, we really want to require more to no more. Typically, things by the line. And it's important to find and follow the rigorous. Next update is related to the Pfas legislation. House Bill 1095, titled Pfas, has been introduced in North Carolina. This proposed legislation protects the residents and the ratepayers of public water systems from necessary Pfas treatment, raising their own responsibility. The legislation will one gives and authorizes the environmental minister commission on recommendation by the review collaboration with the Tfas to adopt drinking water standards. Second is it provides funding to DEQ and the collaborator. And the third is that it authorizes the Secretary of DEQ to order the manufacturer to pay for the actual and necessary costs to public water systems for causing exceedances of the drinking water standards or the 10 parts per trillion and the 70 parts per trillion levels specified. This allows utilities to recover investment and operating costs for the treatment systems that will be needed to address Pfas contamination of drinking water systems. My third update is related to the EPA announcement, which is anticipated in the coming days. EPA is soon expected to announce the drinking water health advisory level for Gen-X, following the agency's release of its final toxicity assessment in the fall of last year. DEQ and DHHS have been preparing for this announcement. The anticipated lower advisory level will enable consent order implementation by dispatcher to assess drinking water replacement requirements as compared to the current 140 parts per trillion. That is the North Carolina specific provisional health goal for Gen-X. In addition to that announcement, EPA is also expected to announce lifetime human health advisory levels for Pfas in the coming days. The agencies are examining, both DEQ and DHHS are examining the current databases to evaluate potential areas affected and sources of drinking water that may require further examination. My fourth announcement is related to Pfas groundwater monitoring. As I mentioned in the last update, our Division of Water Resources has begun sampling for groundwater wells that are within the division's monitoring network. These wells have been being tested for Pfas on all the pollutants that are capable of in addition to the lower Cape Fear counties that we completed in the last quarter, we continue to add additional counties into our sampling plan. As we complete these testing, the results will be posted on our website after appropriate QA/QC checks. Let me also next give you the fifth update, and this is related to a new activity that both departments are working on, and my colleague Virginia will give an additional update regarding their activities. It's related to the fish sample and tissue analysis more of them do with DEQs today. DEQ supporting supporting funding, running, and facilitating a fish collection event this summer in the mid and lower Cape Fear River. This project, as I said, is a collaboration between DEQ and the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, as well as Tfas. From DEQ, two divisions are involved, both our Division of Water Resources and our Division of Marine Fisheries. A variety of species will be collected, processed in our DEQ labs, and analyzed for Pfas for both legacy and commercial labels. This activity will gain information about the fate and transport of Pfas into the food web, and will help us understand the environmental impacts in a more comprehensive way. The water samples will be collected alongside the fish to allow the calculation of bioaccumulation factors needed for DEQ's surface water standards development. That's my update on Pfas. And my last update is related to the accidental chromium that was mentioned earlier. Our department thanks the board for their diligent work in assessing the modes of actions for chromium-6 in drinking water. Now that the Duke Energy Pfas settlement is in place and we are undergoing a series of implementation activities for the last couple of years, we believe that chromium-6 is no longer the most pertinent public health threat in North Carolina. To make the best of DEQ's resources, we will continue to focus on addressing Pfas in North Carolina. EPA is currently in the process of updating the chromium-6 toxicity assessment and will result in federal values that can be implemented throughout our department's programs. This is not to say that DEQ is not actively protecting the public from chromium-6. We continue to include chromium-6 in the triennial review process for surface water standards, where new scientific information is considered and incorporated into the review process. Chromium-6 is also regulated under the North Carolina Toxic Air Pollution Program under the Division of Air Quality, and DEQ follows the EPA's IRIS guidance in regulating chromium-6 inhalation exposures to the level that is cancer protected. A comprehensive update from the EPA, as anticipated soon, will influence all of these programs, as well as several others that are currently in place. So that is the summary of my report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much for the easy update. We have time for questions before we move on to the HHS. Questions from the board? Comments, Jamie?
Just a quick question. Would you restate the dates for public hearings on the discharge permit?
June 23 will be in person at the Cape Fear Community College. I'm sorry, June 21 will be at the Cape Fear Community College, and June 23 will be online. And the times and the venue is posted on our website. I'm happy to forward that announcement to the board.
I'm curious for the NPDES permit, what, if at all, are the process wastewaters going to enter into that discharge permit, or is that a completely separate activity right now? Okay.
Well, this treatment system is handling primarily groundwater extracted.
Thank you.
John?
Thank you very much for the summary. That's really very helpful. I guess this last point about the hexavalent chromium, if I understood what you're saying, is that hexavalent chromium is not the greatest risk. Did you mean from coal ash, or did you mean relative to other risks faced by the population?
Coal ash. I believe that this was before my time, that the request for assistance was due to the work we were doing to address coal ash.
So I think what we were tasked to do is to draw some conclusions based on the state of the science about the shape of the newest response curve at low levels. And so you said that it was not the greatest risk. Is there something else that's greater risk?
I think it was more a statement to imply that at the time we had
decisions and actions in the consent agreement suffice to move on, it sounds like. Thank you.
What was the time frame for the fish sampling? I think you mentioned summer, so is it still into the future?
It's
I know it's not
happening
summer yet, it just feels
It's
like
happening
summer.
right now, and I'll let Franny elaborate and Virginia to elaborate also, but it's quite exciting. It's amazing that both department staff were able to mobilize in a matter of weeks to take advantage of the efficiencies that just that's started. Okay?
Morning. So I'll give you a brief overview of the fish sampling program or project that we're doing and when it is starting. We are working with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission and then DEQ's Division of Water Resources and Division of Marine Fisheries to mobilize sampling in the mid and lower Cape Fear River. We are sampling a variety of species, and the sampling is set to start this week. We've accumulated and are waiting for all the supplies to arrive today. They'll be distributed to our field partners, and they'll be starting their electrofishing and gill netting routine operations this week. And so we should start getting fish by Friday and throughout the summer. They'll be processed in the DEQ Water Sciences Lab, and then we'll be sending them to a third-party contract lab for Pfas analysis that will include the consent order compounds.
Okay, please.
This question is for Frank. I'm curious, why is happening only during summer? Why not, because the discharge is taking place all the time. Why?
Because this is the time of year when people are fishing in the river, and so it's more of a realistic concern for public health, and it's the time of year we're allowed to sample in the river to collect the specimens to analyze in the lab.
So there is no scientific reason, it is just a local reason that seems to impact.
I think one can deduce that by being able to sample a variety of species necessary to understand how it would obtain contaminants in the tissue is just as important as the seasonal variations. If we were to sample in other parts of the year, we may not be able to have access or get access to those different species.
Thank you.
What are the species, just out of curiosity? Something.
We're aiming for a collection of 12 different species, so there is one migratory freshwater species, the American shad, that moves up and down the Cape Fear River, and so the only time to collect the adult shad is in June, and so we're collecting those now. Throughout the rest of the 200-kilometer stretch, we'll be sampling. We're sampling non-migratory fish, so 2 species of sunfish, 2 species of catfish. I can't remember the other ones. And then the Marine Fisheries Division will be collecting the marine and estuarine species, including striped bass, I believe largemouth bass, and there are 3 other ones I can't remember offhand, but I have that information I can provide to you.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Glenn?
And so this doesn't, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this includes both bottom-dwelling, bottom-feeding species and species that tend to remain in the water column?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for DEQ? Deborah?
It's a question about HB 1095 and the standard setting, which I think was related to the first activity that's incorporated in HB 1095. Is this designed to go above and beyond things that EPA might regulate? And in particular, I'm asking because the EPA definition of PFAS doesn't include certain PFAS that are associated with chemours, like PFO3OA or the like, the multi-ethers. So if you could comment a little bit on that, would be nice.
It's a really good question. We have received that question from various constituents, and we are developing a response for that. I think today's presentation that Randy will cover is really what are the most prevalent PFAS concerns in North Carolina, and that the agency should begin this work towards developing a standard or next actions. And you'll see the evidence that's been presented over the last couple of SAB meetings. And then moving forward, we have our own PFAS priority list that we have sufficient either measurements data, questions whether the scientific data exists to support technical analysis. So that's where we're starting, but I do anticipate that we will look into potential definition to be included.
And would this go beyond anything that EPA would set? So could North Carolina set additional standards above and beyond EPA's?
I think we're treating as North Carolina has its unique features and unique circumstances, and we're at the pioneering edge of what that uniqueness looks like. And this body is here to help us to make sure that we're looking at all data sets and information to help provide that as a priority for those PFAS compounds.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to the Health Human Services. Looks like Dr. G. Petrie will do that.
Good morning, everyone. I'm getting some messages that things are hard to hear from people online, so maybe we can all speak up a little bit. It will help try other adjustments as well. But nice to be here with you all. Nice to be here in person. I'm presenting on behalf of DHHS today because Dr. Zach Moore is on leave, and so I'll be representing our efforts. I want to just build a little bit on many of the PFAS updates that Sushma and Dr. Nielsen were just providing, and just say a little bit more about the DHHS role in some of those efforts. Of course, we are supporting those ongoing efforts, including the PFAS legislation that's been discussed, the upcoming EPA announcement, the groundwater testing efforts, and then the fish sampling. And an important point about the fish sampling is that fish consumption advisories are actually calculated by DHHS. So based on the results of the fish sampling that's conducted, we will, take a look at our protocols and see if fish consumption advisories are warranted based on those results. And we're working with DEQ. As mentioned, we worked with them to develop that protocol for the sampling, and then we'll work with them once we get the results as well, of course. I also wanted to mention that we have requested a dermal toxicity study of Gen X from the National Toxicology Program in response to community concerns about dermal exposures. NTP is currently considering that request, and we've been in conversation with them about that. I also wanted to mention that we are updating our PFAS testing and treatment fact sheet. It's currently posted online. This provides some resources for folks who are outside of the area impacted by chemours, so they know how they can get their water tested and filtration options. We're currently updating it with some lower cost options that have also been documented in studies, and so that we have both the highly effective and also more expensive options, and also lower effective but lower expense options as well on that fact sheet. So that should be out hopefully this week. And then we are also evaluating our health communications based on the paper recently published by Dr. DeWitt and others, which is very helpful, gave us some good things to think about in how we're representing PFAS in the health risks. And so we're looking at our health communications, and we'll be updating them as well. I wanted to present a few other efforts that are ongoing in DHHS. One is the development of our environmental health data dashboard. We just recently submitted a proposal to CDC for their environmental public health tracking program. You may be familiar with that program, and we are waiting to hear the results. Hopefully we will hear in August whether we've gotten funded for that, so that we can better track environmental health in our state and communicate those health risks to the public. We're hoping to have not only a communication or combination of environmental and health data in the environmental health data dashboard, but also an environmental justice index. And we're looking at that as part of our efforts as well. So keep your fingers crossed for us. The development of that continues, and we're hoping to have a public version, a beta version, available soon to collect public comment on and continue to improve that. So stay tuned for that. Dr. Kim Gates in the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch, which I lead, is the PI for that grant. And so she'll be leading that effort. For other environmental justice efforts, we have drafted a DHHS comment on the HHS, federal HHS, Environmental Justice Strategy and Implementation Plan. And that comment is currently undergoing internal review, and we hope to submit it by the due date of June 18th. We also continue to provide planning for environmental justice lectures at UNC and elsewhere. We're meeting with external partners to discuss possible health and environmental justice collaborations. And then we have drafted a public participation plan, which is a requirement of Executive Order 246, which came out in January, and that is now posted on our website as well. For climate change efforts, I wanted to mention the ongoing efforts of our Building Resilience Against Climate Effects program, which is CDC funded. We're currently doing our heat-related illness surveillance for the summer and posting those results on our website. We are also developing a climate impact compendium to quantify the climate impacts in our state. This is a CDC requirement for that grant, so we're working on that right now. And we're working on a request for applications to fund a new full-time regional adaptation specialist in the Sand Hills region of the state, which is where that program does a lot of work with the impacted communities in the southeastern part of North Carolina. We have some exciting news. We have a couple of new staff in the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology branch that are replacing some of our vacancies from the past year. So we have Mr. Josh Lohman, who will be leading our HASTE team, the Health Assessment, Consultation, and Education team. That position was formerly held by Beth Dittman. You probably remember Beth. So Josh Lohman is coming to us from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. He brings experience in public health response and in toxicology, and so we're very excited to have him on our team. We're also bringing Dr. Wayne Spoo onto our team, also part of the HASTE team. He has a background in veterinary medicine and toxicology, and he will be conducting the risk assessment portion of the HASTE team's work, along with Josh Lohman and Ashley Graham, who continues on that team as our health educator. So some exciting news there to have some vacancies filled. And then last, regarding this board, I just wanted to let you know that we're in the process of filling the vacancy for the local health department member. We have reached out to the North Carolina Association of Local Health Directors president, and we've started that process to help get that position filled. And hopefully, perhaps by our next meeting, we'll have a new health director on the board as well.
Thank you, Virginia. Are there questions for Dr. Guidry? We have time for a couple, then we need to get moving on Randy's presentation.
Brings the environmental health dashboard, which you mentioned, you said that's the beta version to be our comment, but I wasn't sure what you said.
Yeah, so we're hoping to put out a beta version for public comment and input pretty soon, here in the next few weeks, hopefully. So, I'd be happy to send it to the board. If we actually have a web page now for our environmental health data dashboard that just has a video demo, basically, of it. Yeah, I'm happy to share it.
Other questions? Tom?
No questions, just a comment about Wade Spoo. You probably don't know. Thanks for last report. It's earlier versions.
Oh.
Consider it 7 years. Not like more.
Oh, great.
Yeah, he provides very helpful expertise.
Sounds like a good pickup. Other questions, comments? Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The last bit of business before the break is a presentation from Franny Nielsen, and it's the next step in the evolution of the state's focus on Pfas, in particular compounds. Remember, this started with the building of a database of all the exposure data that were available, back and forth with the board about other columns that would be useful to add. For the
those things that were detected the most frequently, dive into what toxicological data might be available so that you had some combination of what are important compounds that at least we know of exposure-wise, and for which of those might you have data to remember reference those. And this will be a presentation from Franny with time for discussion, and it'll take us up to the break.
Morning. I just want to make sure that what the WebEx viewers are seeing is what's on the big screen. Okay, sorry about that. This morning, I'm going to kind of take us through a refresher of everything that we've talked about over the last couple meetings, and then talk about what our PFAS priorities are and how we might be able to do a toxicity assessment for some of them. So just as a reminder, the importance of reference doses in our ability to do standards development in North Carolina is really important. Without a reference dose, we can't derive any of our ground or surface water standards or our drinking water minimum contaminant levels. The reference dose is also critical to DHHS's work in their fish advisories. This slide is a summary of the top 22 Pfas in North Carolina. This is not an exhaustive list. It is all the Pfas that were sampled in multiple different forms of media by both DEQ and the researchers at NC State. Within this group of Pfas that are found in North Carolina, there are some that are going to be managed by the EPA with their roadmap. They're putting out toxicity assessments for the 9 Pfas on the left side of the screen. And the right side of the screen are the Pfas in North Carolina that the EPA is not planning to address, at least not in the next 4 years. The color differences here indicate whether or not it is a compound that is related to Chemours or part of our consent order with Chemours. And the dark green are the legacy Pfas, or Pfas that are not associated with our consent order. As far as what our regulatory priorities are for DEQ, we have been sampling surface water bodies in the lower Cape Fear around the Chemours facility, and we have been looking at what the major PFAS constituents in those water bodies are. These are 3 pie charts that show just the top 5 PFAS in surface water and well water in these locations. The colors are the same across all 3 pie charts, and so you can see that there are some compounds that are similar across all 3, and they are present in varying concentrations in these 3 different water bodies. The PFAS that the EPA is not planning to address are now subgrouped in these boxes that are highlighted in blue. These are the top 5 PFAS from the former slide. And these are what has become DEQ's priority PFAS group 1. And so this is where DEQ is starting to address the PFAS that the EPA will not be addressing. These are PFAS that are specific to our communities in the lower Cape Fear. These 5 PFAS are not the only ones present in those water bodies, but they're the top 5 across all 3. If you were to look at the top 10, the
5 below these vary across all 3, but these are the 5 that are consistently high in all of the water body samples. These PFAS are of interest and of priority to DEQ because they are what is in the water in the lower Cape Fear. And we also know that there is not a lot of existing toxicity information for these PFAS, and that is where we are today. These 5 PFAS have a lot of exposure data. DEQ has been collecting data on these PFAS for a number of years. We've also seen a lot of data from the researchers at NC State and with the PFAS Collaboratory on all of these compounds and many more. As far as the toxicology references go for these compounds, there are not very many. There are 4 toxicology references for PFMOAA, which is the leading compound in a lot of those water bodies. There are human biomonitoring studies for all of these compounds, and they are present in different concentrations across the populations that have been measured. The references here, some of them are from North Carolina, and then there are also some studies from a population south of a similar fluorotelmer manufacturer in China. And so not all of the biomonitoring data is from North Carolina, but we do know that these compounds are present in humans and do accumulate to some degree. In the former slide, I mentioned that there were 4 toxicology studies for PFMOAA, and here I only have 3. And that's because there were 2 studies out of China from the same group that dealt with the same population. And so the data were not different. They were just different references because they had different discussion points. And so the reference here is linking serum measurements with different biochemical parameters, whereas the other was just more of a biomonitoring study. Overall, in this table of 3 toxicology studies, there are 2 that are immunotoxicity studies and 1 that highlights liver and kidney function. I'm going to take us through brief summaries of these studies, and then I'll get to the point of what we would like the board to help us with. This first study is a 30-day immunotoxicity study in black 6 mice. And this study was done a few years ago. It was published in 2019. There were several different PFMOAA doses, as indicated here on the slide, and there were some noteworthy results. Female mice in this study did have a response in their peroxisome proliferation endpoints. The male mice had increased splenic T cells and NK cells in the high dose. Male mice also had increased thymic helper and cytotoxic T cells in the mid to low range doses. And overall, there was no sign of overt toxicity in either sex over this 30-day dose period, but there were these more delicate and intricate signs of toxicity. The conclusion from this study is that this evidence does support public health concerns for PFMOAA exposure. Even with its low bioaccumulation potential in humans, there still could be adverse health effects based on these exposures. The second immunotoxicity study was published last year in 2021. This is a similar study. It's a 30-day rodent exposure with the same doses for PFMOAA. In this study, there were some observed differences in peroxisome proliferation, but these were not statistically significant in this study. There were also no statistical differences observed for body, liver, or lymphoid organ weights, or peroxisomal enzyme activity or immune function. This is different than the previous study I just mentioned, and as we know in toxicology, there are always different results depending on when the studies are done and how many times you do them. The conclusions for this study suggest that PFMOAA at these doses does have toxicological potential, but it really requires additional studies to determine their health effects via drinking water exposure.
And that is in the fact that some of the results are suggestive in their trends, but there are no statistical differences throughout the paper. The final study is the human biomonitoring study I mentioned that is from China. And the PFMOAA doses here were in serum concentration measurements. It was interesting to note that PFMOAA in this study did accumulate higher than they expected. PFMOAA has what we consider low bioaccumulation potential based on its absorption value or expected absorption value. The PFMOAA concentrations were also higher in males than females, which is a trend we see with a lot of other contaminants. They observed that PFMOAA in human serum increased with age, and that it was not associated with changes in liver and kidney function biomarkers or with lipid metabolism. The conclusion of this study indicates that greater PFMOAA accumulation occurs, and this really highlights the need for more empirical toxicokinetic studies to better understand the toxic mechanisms of this particular contaminant, because it's accumulating in humans in a way that we did not expect. However, this population was exposed over a long period of time. The age cohorts were 0 to 40 years and then 40 and above for the statistically significant age difference. And then they broke the age cohorts down into 4 to 5 groups for a lot of the other studies or a lot of the other analyses. So it's a big cohort and there were a lot of different components to it, but there were no relationships observed with the biomarkers they looked for. As far as an overall summary of just the 3 toxicology studies, in humans, we're seeing that PFMOAA accumulates in greater concentrations than we would expect, that the serum concentrations increase with age, and that PFMOAA in human serum was not associated with changes in liver or kidney function. While the accumulation of PFMOAA was unexpected, its increase with age is a normal phenomenon we observe with contaminants. And the fact that the serum concentrations were not associated with liver and kidney biomarkers isn't surprising because we don't know when the exposure occurred or when the toxic mechanisms for exposure occur at their highest point. We could be monitoring and observing a relationship that happened a long time ago, and so the biomarkers are no longer in the serum. As far as the mice studies go, the results indicated there were increased splenic T cells and NK cells, along with thymer helper and cytotoxic T cells in the male rodents. A peroxisome proliferation response was observed in female rodents, and there were some sex-specific differences in peroxisome proliferation that were not statistically significant, but were definitely suggestive of changes in this particular response. As far as my overall conclusion, this is just some evidence to support the public health concerns for PFMOAA exposure. Even with its low bioaccumulation potential in humans, we can see that it is accumulating in a way that we don't fully understand, and high chronic environmental doses could still lead to adverse health outcomes. As far as our request to the Science Advisory Board for these particular studies, DEQ is asking that you review these 3 studies in detail and assess the quality of the studies in terms of low, moderate, or high, the same way you would assess the quality of a study for a systematic review. And this is just based on sample size, dose regimes, and endpoints measured. We're really interested in what you think of these 3 studies and how well done they are and what the quality of this data is. The second task we would like to ask of you is if you could determine if there is a consensus across these 3 studies that could be used as a point of departure for eventual reference dose derivation. Some of the studies, both of the immunotoxicity studies looked at some of the similar endpoints, and then the human exposure study looked at 2 different ones. And so if there is a consensus across the 3, what is this proposed point of departure? And the third and final ask for this particular presentation
is, do these studies provide enough scientific support to utilize this proposed point of departure for deriving a reference dose now? Are these 3 studies enough that we could ask DHHS to calculate a reference dose based on a consensus and a point of departure? And so I'm asking that we take a look at these. I will send them to you and I can print them out and provide them to you in hard copy. We can discuss this at the next meeting or through email. However is most effective for you. We're interested in your scientific expertise and whether or not this is enough information to support the work we need to do. That's it for this presentation. So I can take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Franny. It's very clear to me. I'd suggest putting that last slide back up so that we can have a brief discussion first on clarity of what's being asked, and then we'll have time for any questions on this particular compound, as well as the first part of the presentation on how they got from bar. I think the ask in number 1 is extremely clear. Study quality. If anybody has any questions about number 1, or that's clear on the board, because this will be our work between now and the next meeting, probably independently, in terms of reviewing papers and coming ready to talk about them next time. But a yay, nay on study quality, we've done that before. Any questions about that one for clarity? I guess I'm just trying to make sure that the charge is narrow as possible. Yes, Bobby.
Is there any information in the immunotox studies about how the doses that we use compare with potential environmental exposure? We talked about high level chronic exposures environmental. No.
Sure. Those are, it's a point that the authors make a real effort to explain and rationalize. And I think that doing these studies in rodents is definitely different from environmental exposure to a person in the way that it would accumulate internally. But the authors do explain how they reached those doses and why they use them relative to the environmental measurements. So yes. I can read them again and let you know. I can't remember exactly the discussion. Yes.
That'll be part of our homework too. Dosing regimen and relevance is part of looking and I think too in terms of quality for the pharmaceutical purpose.
That's very point. I think, Randy, what you presented back in April included a chart that had the environmental levels in it. So here on the chart I'm looking at from last meeting, so 95,000 nanograms. Bigger thing. I don't know how to compare it. Milligrams per kilogram body. Yeah. Single dose study.
They were daily oral gavage for 30 days.
Study. I have a picture.
Well, I wanted to offer that I can provide the board with all of the raw data for these studies, so we have raw data files. I'd also like to suggest that maybe the Vance study not be considered, because this was a master's thesis and we redid that study. Sam still was working out some of the methods for process proliferation. But I have the raw data for that study. I have the raw data for all of the studies included in Woodruff et al. Paper. So I'm happy to provide the raw data. The raw data includes our study protocols as well. So you can review protocols, which has the dose selection, rationalization as well. So happy to provide all of those.
That'll be great. To share those with Brandy so that we have them in one place. Folks can access the published works and the data behind it. It's like supplemental material. Let's make sure that we're clear on what the ask is. Does anybody have to change it around? So just any questions? Are there any concerns with number 1 just being a review of data quality and being able to say high, medium, or low, fit for purpose? People got it? Any concern? All right, so we can move on to number two. If there's any more questions about number one, I'll open it up. Any questions? Any more questions about number one?
Well, I guess maybe not a question, but a comment. There's tools available for evaluating quality. One thing that we would want to do is find tools, different tools, like focus, but the decision we have to also make is published study, so we can deal with very different outcomes, and then also have an impact on what DPQ would actually be required to use for driving plan for purchase. Those are questions that kind of begin.
In terms of SOPs, when we did 10X, we talked about that, and then also hexavalent chromium, being explicit about what we were going to use in terms of guidance. So we could add that step. I think we can also share that around by email as examples. So we did share some of the systematic review tables with consider when we were doing the hexavalent chromium.
The general point here is we're being asked to do the work instead of evaluating what the state has done.
Number one, I think, is evaluate the study similar to what we were asked for on methyl bromide. We were given one that was epidemiological in nature and didn't have measured exposures, and we said, doesn't seem fit for purpose. So I take it that we're providing a review of the studies before they do all that homework to tell them whether or not that it's worth the time to invest in doing the work.
And oftentimes, the board would review what they've done and evaluate the quality of their review. Here, the board is being asked to do the review. Do that work through consensus, which is what we do. If they just think quite true and understand what you're doing, that's quite a bit of work more than doing what plan. We pull it together. And summarize it very nicely. We're being asked to actually do weight this review, have characteristics for how we do it. On conclusions. Different role that peer review board is actually working for. We're all okay with that, right?
I'm not so sure. That's not a lot. Our efforts on chromium, for example, not a bromide saying, I would say this. These were just 3 studies, so maybe we're better. Process can be extended, but 3 studies is not. I don't know. I don't know that we should be asked to do it. So it says, I would feel more comfortable. That's not the quality.
Other comments on that? I feel like we've done both. We've been asked and have responded correctly to study quality. And we've been asked to review the reasonableness of the people's summary, and then we've also been asked to do it ourselves for a whole class. So, all those things are within the scope. SAP has expanded 2015, 17, has advisory role, has consultatory roles, has advisory peers roles. It's pretty broad. It's no longer just document review. So I guess I would consider it to be scope, but I welcome other perspectives. At least step one with 3 studies is that there are enough here to go on the event. Other perspectives on it?
order that it's within scope, as long as we don't, as long as the scope is set up front and doesn't morph, or if it does get to a point where it could be expanded, that there's a discussion of what that expansion would look like. And again, specific, what I would describe as charge question here. I think it is consistent with all our roles in the past, and I've been around, well, I haven't been around as long as Tom has, but I've been around on the former incarnations of this board for a long time, and the asks have been broad. Then I do have one specific ask that I would like is, I would like if you don't already have it, to assemble a table of his chem properties. And I can provide you specifically with what I want. And what I'm interested in is things that might inform the PK and pharmacokinetics and the expectations one might have in terms of when we look at these studies and look at what vehicles were used and dosing rates and so on. That's all I want.
And so let me just say, I'm certainly capable and can do all of those things. Since there were so few studies, I did not want to presume to take the role as the expert reviewing them above the members of the board, since you are all experts in your field. And so if you would prefer that I review it and provide you with the summary, I can certainly do that. I just didn't want to presume that was the best course of action.
I'm fine with the agencies. I mean, we worked with the agencies. We were impaneled by the agencies doing the work that we're asked, provided that everybody agrees on what the side boards are, and for a brief study of data quality. I guess I'd be okay with that from the standpoint of us helping make sure that we use staff time wisely. At least it's clear to me. We haven't been asked to do much heavy lifting, along. Any more comments on number one?
I think that I might have a tiny little bit of a conflict, at least with two of the studies, since they are data that came from my lab. So I'd like to ask that I be allowed to answer any questions that board members or PPQ may have about the studies, but that I probably shouldn't contribute to the discussion of the quality of the studies, because I would like to assert that our studies are very high quality. Different eyes may come up with different opinions. So I don't want that to be a perceived conflict if I am saying that my qualities are high studying and other board members may disagree or want to learn on with me.
Sure, I appreciate that. We can be available to participate, but you're comfortable that certainly as a person you can fill in the blank on any question regarding study design, different quality, things like that, be very helpful. Let's look at number two. My sense is that, if the answers to number one was that there was enough high quality data to proceed, then we might be moving into, these horsepower. It's going to be a harness for diving into the data to pick a point of departure and work toward a consensus one. But the people understand what's being asked there, regardless of we could put a pause and say, that for the next meeting, the work would be just answer number one. There'd be enough work there to do what Dr. Gorman has suggested and share examples around the different processes that are used to evaluate data quality, because we don't have standards that indicate sort of what those are. Making decisions about which ones would be used, and then come back with the answer on data quality before the work is done to then dive into the next one. So,
And the challenge with you is you're mixing animal studies. So those would be different. How are you normalizing I would just point out that it can be very challenging to come up with a point of departure between human biologically important. actually it has to. And doubtful from what you said, the biomonitoring data actually from the function got it all studied. So the other question would be, will all studies are preparing for applications for them?
Yeah, does it make sense to you, Frank,
Yeah, I think that is absolutely fair.
in terms of a rephrased?
Yeah.
Ask to.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you mean by the difference, or what's meant by the difference between number 2 and number 3? Number 2 is looking for a number, and then number 3 is whether it's advisable to move on that number now versus wait for more data. Or tell me what is broken out separate.
The intention for number 2 was just to determine if there is a consensus across the studies for what just the point of departure could be, not even a concentration, but if it's peroxisome proliferation or immunoglobulin M or a different metric of toxicological significance. Like, is there a specific endpoint we can define that could be used as a point of departure based on these studies? And then the third is there enough scientific evidence to support using that for a reference dose?
And is it important that there be consensus? If you only had one study and it was survived the data quality review from step 1 and hung together toxicologically in terms of it makes sense, then you can derive a point of departure from that. It'd be important that studies be consistent in terms of endpoint. I guess I'm struggling with the word consensus there and why that's important, because I think when we did Gen X, we were like, there can be a variety of different endpoints that are meaningful as long as the study design is sound. Different points of departure can be big discussion about the relative risk based on those different ones.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think that it doesn't necessarily need to be a consensus. I think that if there is one study that is of much higher quality than another, then using that study's endpoints for the point of departure would be appropriate. And I think whatever the board decides is scientifically sound is what DEQ would start with. If it was not determined that it was enough scientific support or it was not scientifically sound, then we would either wait for more studies to be published and reassess the question, or look for other mechanisms of protecting the public from these compounds in the environment.
Other questions? Then maybe we could suggest a refinement. Number 2, really.
Now that consensus doesn't mean absolute agreement, it means general agreement. So in my opinion, if studies show detectable concentrations or effects across different doses, that would be a consent.
Yeah, you had the data to see it, but the question is completely naive in terms of looking for harmony there when I don't know that it's necessary. A point of departure levels to go when gets studied complete. Any other questions about number 2? Relative to, oh, go ahead, Al.
You might choose. I think it's really the relevant question of the studies for the contact. Two studies has to get the board. Quality, whether or not they were designed directly provisional. So like if it's going back like provisional EPA approaches to provisional. So to me, there's one good study, so 3, that's talking to the EPA. It's called the divisional R&D. Publishing very good. What I don't know what 2 is actually something the board or the
I think that's where I was. There's a balance to what John and Tom have mentioned as well, the review of data quality, and then moving to number 3 in terms of would they be fit for the purpose of deriving a point of departure. maybe adequate advice to then turn it back over to staff to do the work of calculating points of departure and looking for differences between studies and recommending whatever the other thing.
And like Dave Donald, when eventually say, look, most of the ways that you evaluate study quality outcome depend for which you may be doing with additional approaches to things like this bias. Those are all the evaluating based on. There's the bias to be different, the outcome is different times for similar times. So what ends up happening is one, it depends on how much your framework is applied. It targets it says to quality or anything. If you're addressing the question of whether or not those outcomes of interest for the study are actually defined. Not just, you don't just look at the study, you have to look at the study in the broader context.
I think there's a course and a time now too for that study quality in terms of, you know, even things like the RBIS is measured and adequately be able to be followed through for. Elena?
Just another ask, right now, ask a date. For the benefit of everybody else in the room, coming from across a broad range of disciplines, could you just briefly explain risk bias?
I'll try to answer the context of NTP don't have in the world of animal toxicology, there's really only well-established guidelines for you. To study quality based on there's a number of different ways to look at it. Bias that you put okay. So that's tying into things like the study one, but just been blinded. What we're looking is each of those risks are bias outcomes, coupled with pharmaceutical industry to know the facts that change effect science. That's the literature. So it's not just equality. Look at study quality separate from that, using some of the erotic guidelines that are like one study. And that's a different thing. That's kind of something we decided as a board. How are you going to assess what quality is? For example, how stable is chemical? How well were the patients made? How what are the blind needed to say outcomes of solid? Those become very key decisions that we have to make. And then what normally happens is most of the budget is by more than one consensus. Two or three board members said, yes, for these individual domains of study quality, we agreed the quality is high, low, moderate, or whatever. Not an unfair work to do.
John?
He makes a very good point. Another option about you want provides some guidance to the state. In the X-ray program, a little bit, some big efforts. Yeah, this is only a couple studies. Easier for us. Pretty slow. That's what we do. I think I went in here and so we've done this before with the just wondering if it's the role of the board to really work with providing guidance to the state this state product. We are if we just didn't decide if we want to take it on. Again, the position is yes, but no, what we're going to do. I want to make it clear that it's not.
All right. We'll have time to pick this back up after the lunch break. And I suggest that we think about it over lunch, spend like 5 minutes, and we call back the group, because the next presentation is Franny's as well. And we should have time to be able to wrap this one up before we move to the next one. So if you're thinking about whether or not we take the charge as is and share the guidance among ourselves, and just bring your own perspective to the next meeting on study quality. We're not asking there for a consensus on study quality, just feedback on study quality. If we had to provide a consensus on study quality, I agree that we have to agree on a set of methods for it, but it could just be perspective. So be thinking about that, and then we'll try to narrow it down to a specific charge, and that way to be to identify the methods or modify these for what we're doing between now and the next meeting. Definitely. I think the approach we took with the next was collaborative, doing the SOPs for how we do risk evaluations are dated. And we talked about that when we started General, and the decision was called the time that it would take to derive new methods when we could simply cite others in the document for transparency as well as scientific credibility was the preferred path for time. Still an option as well. All right. Thank you, Franny. We'll spend at least 5 minutes on this when we regroup before we move on to the next topic with trying to refine the charge. We will regroup in an hour. Thanks so much. In about 2 minutes. Call it back to order, and we'll revisit the charges. Maybe we could bring them back up on the screen and decide to path forward for the body department. I have a follow-up question on the overall presentation too. Maybe we can spend a little bit of time on that in case people have questions on the first part. So for EFMOAA, the departments have narrowed down their Pfas, but those that are legacy compounds, those that are a little bit more North Carolina specific. Got the ones that are North Carolina specific, further narrowed it down to those that EPA is going to work on, that EPA is not going to work on, leaving them as high priority targets for the department. They've asked us to look at 3 studies that they've identified and rank them for data quality. I'll summarize that as they asked for number 1. Number 2, I think we came to the conclusion that we could potentially delete and move straight to number 3, which is if the studies are of medium or high quality, that they serve as an adequate basis for deriving immunity. And it's an advisory board, it's not a rulemaking board, so the advice can be disparate, as it sometimes is. That's easily done between now and the next meeting. Consensus statements require a lot of back and forth, like we did on something like that. So I'll entertain any feedback on that as a refined charge of 1 as written, strike number 2, and number 3 being also within our charge about the adequacy of the data support. That's feedback that we would provide next time, but not necessarily reaching consensus unless that is a further charge. Because that seems like a reasonable path forward to both all of the board members as well as the department. Yes, for Tom. Rich, but you're really okay with that. And we'll augment that with what we don't have right now. I'm not sure the SOP for how we can do that. I think that'll be informative. Delay us from having to establish that SOP for how to do that when there's a variety of different reasons people might ask us to review studies short of a full systematic review. Let's do that. We'll let elements to the journal. I had a question about overall. Anything else on the charge before we move on? I was going to dial it back to yes, John. I think it's okay. I think it would be useful to share with the board. What I can do. I think that would be helpful to them. That's the starting point. How do you do that? Anyway. Yeah, let's share those. You can share them with me and Randy and make sure everybody else gets them. There's also some that were referenced heavily during the program. Find people those are available. I also think that it's short of having established SOPs, which become essential when we're going to reach consensus, but until then, a round robin of professional opinion on what people think about data quality from their own internal SOP or documents that they would rely upon and be fine. So thank you for your help on that. After that revised charge for that. That's going to be okay with the department.
Yeah.
Needs to be for great. I was wondering, the final list, the emerging list about ABM byproduct 2, the compound that didn't show up in the surface water or the groundwater to the extent the other ones did. It did show up in the serum of fish and serum of people. What are your thoughts on that? And I guess I would invite the board as well in terms of a priority compound. Maybe not as high in environmental. Was the thanks the part that we're seeing over. and it's one for which we received the presentation from EPA on the toxicity study.
Sure. So the priority list was derived from our surface and well water measurements. And so DEQ's standards are surrounding different water bodies. So we have groundwater and surface water. And so we were using the leading compounds in those water bodies to determine what our priority list would be. I agree that naphthalene byproduct 2 is one we should not forget about. There is different exposure data for it, and it has been measured in about 50% of our samples. It's not one that shows up every time, and it's not one that shows up in very high concentrations in the water if it's detectable at all. The fish serum study, I think, is really interesting, and I'm curious to see what the fish tissues we examine this summer will show, because I think that will tell us more about what humans may be consuming and how it's going from very low concentrations in the water to being accumulated in humans. I think that could be a link that might bring it higher on our list. The first 5 are the ones that we showed, and then there are, the next 4 are a few that are similar in name and structure. The PF 030A, and then there's 040A and 5DA. Those are like the next 2 right after the first 5, and then naphthalene byproduct 2 is further down the list, but it is still certainly there. And this is just the first group we're addressing, so it's definitely still in the limelight as far as we're concerned. We're just waiting until we get a little more information, since it's not a leading compound in water.
Yeah, I don't know the detection chemistries of not affecting the water because of like that. Line including only very sound that the sound thing on the medium to actually enforce some regulation for management on. Just curious about that one. Yeah, sure. Any other questions about the state or the fishing process in general?
Sure.
We were up this much very, very limited. We were aware of other studies that might be coming out.
There might be a study coming out once I wrap up with the agreement and submit it to the journal. So there'll be a study on DFMOA with different administered doses. And there'll also be a study of the byproduct 2, and there'll also be a study of the PFMOA index with the byproduct. I will consider that a very strong urging. I have a question. Well, as representative DQ. So you have the Pfas arranged by different groups, and these are priority groups based on the presence in water and potential toxicity and presence in people. Is there any, can we interpret the groups as possibly meaning management groups? In other words, if you are able to derive a reference dose for the FMOA, would you, by extension, apply that to the other Pfas in that group? Well,
That is definitely something that we're learning about. The lack of toxicity data for most of these is a challenge, and I think that there are some really interesting and well thought out methods for extrapolating to Pfas we don't know a lot about from those that we do. But that's kind of the topic of my next presentation, to go into that in a little greater detail and to see what your thoughts are on the group that is putting out a lot of that right now. Yeah, we're learning about it.
You remind us the compound that the company did logical on the night.
Through the consent order. It's PMPA, PEPA, PFMOAA, naphthalene byproduct 2, and HXA.
So most of the ones on the short list will be the subject of any toxicity studies course we'll be doing for fun.
Yes, and also aquatic toxicology studies as well. So fish, algae, and worms and segment. With respect to the consent order studies, the current mammalian toxicology protocols they've submitted have not been approved. And we know that it will be at least 6 months after approval before the studies start at the contract lab. So we don't have a good estimate of how long it will be before those studies begin or how long it is before we have data from them. Just like,
2 years or more.
yes. Yes. It was, and so we considered oysters and a few other invertebrates, and based on the groups that are able to do our field collections and it being outside of oyster season, they said that collecting them now wouldn't be a good proxy for what humans would be consuming. Also, they are opportunistically going to provide us with crab and anything else that comes in their net, so there is the opportunity for that. We just don't know how many to expect, so I didn't include it as an official species we're targeting, but hopefully we'll have some.
All right. Well, thank you all for your work to help us refine a charge. I do think it's good progress. Started. A lot of focusing on surface water and groundwater exposure over that. The next presentation is also about planning, summary of potential methods, and scientifically assessing the Pfas in North Carolina, which have limited toxicity data. Presentation and after discussion after this as part of PPP's path forward on how to address those compounds.
All right. Thanks again for having me here presenting. What I'm going to go over with this presentation, it's fairly brief. And as I mentioned, these are methods we're learning more about and trying to assess as far as their scientific defensive, being scientifically defensible in terms of what our rulemaking authority is, and if we were to employ some of these, how we might have to either rework some of our rules or figure out a way to implement this in a creative fashion. So this is a slide you've seen. These are the 5 Pfas that we are focused on right now. This is the first group of what will probably be several, and they don't have much toxicity data. Here's this table again, and it just highlights that there are, only a few toxicity references for just one of these 5, and the other 4 have no existing data at this point. The question we have really is, how do we regulate these Pfas that don't have any toxicity data? Is it possible for us to do that? And how can we protect the public from any potential health effects of these chemicals we know very little about? Over the last year and a half, we've heard a lot about different Pfas grouping strategies. Grouping Pfas is complicated, and it really should be done using scientifically sound and defensible methods. That way, our analysis and our conclusions hold up in terms of a rulemaking process. Also that they should use as much of the toxicological data that is available as possible. And we have a lot of toxicological data for some of the legacy PFAS, like Pfas and PFOA, and very little for others. We've heard from a lot of different researchers, different states and different government agencies about the ways that they have grouped PFAS and how they have chosen to collectively regulate them or regulate them individually. In reviewing all of these presentations and all of the methods that were presented to us, we think that there are two that utilize much of the toxicological information available and extrapolate through these data-heavy methods in the best way that they can. These are the relative potency factor approach, which builds on this assumption that the combined toxicity of two or more substances can be calculated based on the concept of just dose addition. And the substances have about the same effect, but differ only in their toxic potencies. And so this is something that has been used for other classes of, large classes of chemicals that are very similar, like PCBs. The second is grouping by either adverse effects or mechanism of action. And this is really the most demanding approach, requiring the most data. And you would only be able to group PFAS that have the same adverse effects or modes, mechanism of actions, and therefore toxicokinetics for risk assessment. These were two of the methods that Dr. Ian Cousins presented and summarized in his paper. And so this is a snippet of that large table that outlined the PFAS that are grouped together, and then in terms of the data requirements for them. So this is the very bottom of the table that has the most intense data requirements and generally the fewest amount of PFAS grouped together based on those requirements. There are distinct advantages to these two methods, and that is that the cumulative risk assessment that comes out of them is scientifically stringent and very defensible in terms of a rulemaking authority. There are limitations associated with both of them. Limitations for the relative potency factor approach are really based on the endpoints that are used in the studies. That's what the potency will be based on. And then for the grouping by mechanism of action or toxic effect, it's just a resource and data sink. If there's no data, then it's not something that the models can really build on. So the question next is, how do we collect all of this existing PFAS data and use it to extrapolate for the PFAS that don't have their own toxicity information? And there is a group at the EPA in the Center for Computational Toxicology and Exposure that is doing this exactly. The first step in their process was they created this very large PFAS screening library, and they identified 75 Tfas to conduct this high throughput toxicity testing on. The second step was that they used that high throughput testing results as well as the various computational toxicology databases they have access to and conducted bioactivity profiling that was related to molecular structure. They did this for 142 PFAS that were screened in human liver cells. And so they're all that similar liver effect that the relative potency factor approach referenced. This study examined new, it should say unknown, or no, new and known, yes. So some unknown and known PFAS targets for biochemical activation. And the PFAS structures or structural features were found to be correlated with these biological targets. And so that speaks a lot to grouping these things together by molecular structure or physiochemical properties. These two publications have come out very recently, and the computational toxicology group at the EPA is really driving the new approach methodologies for PFAS toxicity data forward in a really impressive way. And so really the request that I have for you is to look at both of these studies and help us determine if this is an appropriate method to use for extrapolating those PFAS in North Carolina that we don't have toxicity data for. Sorry, going back to this one. a lot of the bioactivity information and profiling for Pfas has gone up. So there's many Pfas that we don't know anything about. And then there are some that we know a lot about. And so a lot of the Pfas that were examined here were grouped together by structural class or a molecularly similar group. So the perfluoral ethercarboxylic acids were all considered one, and they grouped them by their finest level of detail that they could ascertain based on the data they have. And so in the situations where PFMO, like with PFMOAA, in the future, we might have enough information to derive a specific reference dose for that exact Pfas. And that would be the best approach because it's based on empirical toxicological data. In the absence of that, could we take that theoretical future reference dose for PFMOAA and group all of the Pfas in that same class together based on that reference dose because they're structurally similar, have the same targets or the same adverse effects? These are the two methods that DEQ is learning about right now. And then in searching all of the methods and computational new approach methodologies that are out there, the EPA's group has routinely come back up in the search and done extensive work in driving this field forward. And so this is really the summary of what is being done for those two data intensive methods that we're learning about. And this is what could be the way that we could do this. But I'm interested in what the board's thoughts are about this kind of approach. And if there are other approaches that are similar that should also be added to the body of information we're learning about.
Brandon, I'll start by saying, are you teaming up these two in particular because there's already kind of a science risk management discussion internally about the other ones that Dr. Cousins table and the other approaches that were explored, as you know, presentations from Jersey, Massachusetts, Michigan.
So there has been an internal discussion, and the way that we feel we can move forward in a way that would support our rulemaking authority is to use these methods that have the most scientific data included. The methods in Dr. Cousins' paper, I think, are summarized in a lot of what the EPA's work is doing. These two methods, the relative potency factor approach in all of the 142 Pfas that have been analyzed in those liver cells, like that's a lot of relative potency together. And they've done a lot of that work in the second paper they published. Grouping them by adverse effects or modes of action, I think this is a really interesting way to go about this. And depending on the level of biochemical organization, you could find rationale for grouping them all based on PPAR alpha activation or further molecular initiating or key events down the biochemical pathways. So I think there's an interesting conversation there that could be supported by the work that the EPA is doing.
That helps. Carrying down the world. It might be equivalent over terms, but I guess I would say that how do you get to relative potency or the final in there? It's not compounds for which you don't have toxicological data. It might just not have reproductive effect study, but to get a relative potency back, we're going to have some or maybe. Let's first start with any questions for Franny, then we'll bring back up their final questions first, and then we'll look at the target.
Have you been in contact with these people and asked the very same questions with them?
So I haven't been in contact with them in the last few months. My last year as a postdoc at the EPA, I worked with this group. And so I know a lot about the different things that they're doing. But no, I have not actually. I've been meaning to reach out to Keith, who was the first author on the second paper, about this exactly. And I just haven't had the opportunity to do that yet.
It would be useful to have them conversation.
I think it's a great idea.
And we could include the compounds of interest in those hydrogen streams, as long as you've got that. Got a relative potency factor, at least on some endpoints. And those endpoints end up being ones that make sense toxicologically, mode of action, why it just get stronger and stronger. Absent having that in among the 75 compounds in the first one or the compounds in the second one. You get there. You would have a relative factor. Other questions for Fran?
I was going to say that was when you were describing the potential approaches. That was going to be my ask is somebody could give a nice comprehensive overview of this to the board because again, it's not everybody's area of expertise, and I think it would help put people on a common level of understanding and give everyone an opportunity to ask questions and everyone to hear the answers.
I think it's a great idea. I'll reach out to them.
Jamie?
I encourage that as well. And I'm actually thinking if you could comment a little bit on the assays, because the first publication is on specific effects in the liver. And I think that the positive control chemicals that they use because they elicit positive outcome in these very specific cell-based assays that are operative through very specific mechanisms. So my biggest concern is that we have good enough understanding of these different assays so that we don't view a negative hit for a Pfas as being negative of toxicological concerns across other toxicities. I'm not saying that the board is going to do that. I think there is the danger of some interpreting this data that way. Oh, it didn't produce it in this assay, therefore it's not toxic. No, it's just not producing a very specific mechanism in one specific way.
I agree with that. And I think that it's part of the challenge of modeling compounds like this. Because you're coding things yes or no to feed the model a certain way. And so, yes, it definitely is a limitation and caveat of something like this.
Still, I mean, to get our own potency factor, it's got to be responsive in an assay or a sweet assay that it's a zero. There's not much of a mistake in going on. Binding affinity to a relevant receptor or induction of the first of a series of cascadal events, like the technical endpoint, it could still be relevant. I guess I see what them drawing the bar here is not going to use a grouping approach that's very efficient. It's going to have to be something that serves more that looks those a factor of X. But that's imperfect because it's not too comparable long-term reproductive effects.
Sure, provided that the right adverse outcomes are included in the assay. And certain suites of assays might not include the outcome that is most relevant to protection.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that is I'm not directly involved in this work, but I can tell you that internally at a high level, coverage of your toxicological space in terms of relevant endpoints that's a discussion that's ongoing and front and center in any of this kind of work.
Other questions?
I was just going to add, for example, if we look at the suites of immunotoxicity assays that are cell-based that are available, to my knowledge, none of them recapitulate the suppression of the vaccine response that we see in human populations. So if you have a negative hit from suites of assays with immunotoxicity, they might not tell you anything about what has to be system to do with function that is regarded as a sensitive endpoint now.
It's a good example.
Questions or comments on the presentation in general before we revisit the charge question?
This isn't science. In other words, the decision he used to apply the rulemaking Congress. That's science. And so I guess the question is, it's within the internal discussions, the thing that's held back using placing big data is the application of the science, which whether or not the policy decisions that people make. mistakes with these important. So where do you stand? I mean, you're asking us to judge the science when it's ultimately you can set whatever policy decision you want. Right? You know, we come back and say the rats are better than in vitro. That's a policy. And it's not really, it was never based on science to say that you know, like, traditional rodent neurotox, developmental toxic culture temper is going to be the gold standard. So here, this is an equivalent policy decision as far as using in vitro systems to come up with these values. That's a policy decision.
That's true. And so the big conversation, at least as far as I've been involved, not just the DEQ, but between policymakers and those that are deriving and working with the new approach methodologies, is how comparable are they to animal data? Like, is it actually comparable? Because that is what we need to make policy. And so by having the board evaluate these studies and say this is scientifically defensible, that helps us move this forward as far as policy is concerned. That's why we're here.
So in other words, like in the 11 policy was written in such a way that using AI was supposed to lead to outcomes that were the first step. The step was being explicit. That was the bar. It should be no worse than critical. Or critters are not all that good to begin.
It's true.
So if the critters are not all that good to begin, but you know, predict 40 to 60% of the time, that's a bar. I guess I'm just trying to get clarification that that's clearly a policy. That using NAMs could be somewhere like Biomonitoring no worse than what it helps them. Because then when we come back to what's our benchmark, if the benchmark is Immunotoxicity, you don't know relevant, you're not going to know. In other words, like if the point of departure, these assays aren't going to be relevant for them. And then what? I mean, that becomes a separate policy decision. On a proximal liberator assay or liver assay, then relative potency in the non-target cell type can be applied to a genotoxin point system.
I mean, the theory and practice of new approach methodologies is not something that I can debate, truly. I think it's the way forward as far as removing animals from toxicology. And I was part of a project where we compared animal data and how reproducible it is. And I know that it is not always as predictable as we would hope. As far as the policy decision has not been made. This is what we're here to find out, if this is a scientifically defensible and scientifically sound way of doing this, and what your expert opinions are. And when we have that, we can move forward with internal discussion. It is.
Area. Seeking examples supported by good evaluation. We do these comparisons. Policy, that's policy not there. Lots of bakers, granting, others are looking. Well, one kind of evidence, formative to a policy choice made at some point. Some people would argue it's great. NAM data is great for hazard prioritization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I'm hearing, sensing it, you're asking, are we at the point where this set of data?
And based on the compounds that we know our population is exposed to, that we have no information on, it's not a normal suite of contaminants yet.
Right. Don't do anything. No. It's like do nothing or try to do something. No problem.
The question I'm asking is, previous discussion. seem like at the end of that discussion, we might come back hypothetically, come back and say, these are moderate to high quality studies, and we think of putting the studies in the and then it would be based upon outcome as we find concordance or non-concordance of these. Right? So that's ultimately what you're doing. And the suite of outcomes within those studies is pretty good. The thing is, the follow-up question is whether this approach would be informative or be able to extend that point of departure through some approach, like the welcome to potency or others, that are of interest to you. That's the real fundamental question there. And the answer is whether or not the systemic cell aspect have any relevance to that point of departure.
Well, I don't think that it's limited to the hepatic cell assays. That's the publication that has come out already. And I know the group is working on a lot of different things. And so if the immunotox endpoint is what we derive and that's what our point of departure comes from, then I think utilizing that and trying to either use a high throughput model or a toxicokinetic model, or even reaching out to this group to see how we can apply these new endpoints to these compounds would be appropriate.
Based upon the point of departure. Just trying to make sure.
And the answer to that would probably, vary by individual depending on how close they wanted to see the mandates as a toxicological anchor was in the primary study. Yeah, but or they might. Yeah, you had an immunological endpoint for one, the robust study, and then there was a similar immunological screen that put it action-wise, trigger some part. So I would get it. I think, in part, when the board was asked, they gave lots of perspectives on different grouping strategies, broadly. So they didn't want to see grouping without toxicological data to justify that. But there think there really be a consensus on that. But we did conclude there is a scientific basis that it's reasonable to explore better depending on how certain the uncertainty. So we didn't throw anything out. People definitely expressed preference. A couple of people were very strongly in preference of, grouping without toxicological endpoints. I could see how it would be more of an advisory role on strength of association to justify relative potency factors relative to some anchor study that everybody had confidence in the high quality and informative. And then the answer could be, as you point out, that it doesn't. That assay that is used to establish relative potency factors is drastically different or irrelevant to this endpoint. Maybe when it's functional for chemical X at potency, like it would make sense to put those two things together to be able to justify a hemoglobin.
But it could also be policy decisions that if the relative focus is way too general, that actually gets supported by the initial account that said that's for the chemistry. But it could actually be dependent. Let's say the absence of data, because it's probably public. Policy. What happens if you make that policy decision today? You don't have the potential better than nothing. Better than nothing. You have to go still, but better than nothing. You say, in we revisit it as this data becomes available or be across the So that's what I'm wondering is that policy decision that just brought into discussion. Just giving the relevant potency down to one over.
And it's a similar question to the one that I started the session out with, because that is one of the options higher up in this table that goes from really first involved in the ability to typical requirements, but we're down to two now. But there was one of just the student who did a risk-based drawing.
And it was also a lot lighter on the data requirements for it. So that's why I left it out.
Some people on the board said they would support that. Let's look at the charge question.
So I think when I wrote this, I was also thinking of having someone from the computational toxicology group come and give a presentation. And so I think that especially in light of a lot of the questions, having a presentation from that group would be more appropriate than perhaps addressing this right away, because they'll be able to answer the questions much better than I can.
Okay.
So
That makes sense.
we can table this.
Questions that it might help in teeing that up. For any of the 5 compounds that are a priority for the departments right now.
They're included at a higher level of organization, so not compound specific, but by their like carboxylic acid or ether carboxylic acid groups, like EF, ECAs, that level of organization.
Departments would be willing to take a surrogate chemical relative potency instead of an actual chemical relative potency.
It's something that we're learning about and trying to determine how our rules would allow us to do this. And part of that is determining if it's scientifically defensible or not.
Yeah, because I think that would change that. Surrogate chemical question. Specific. If you're specific chemical there, not tips to look at. Probably not that. Surrogate.
I know that it's been done for some different things the group was doing. I can't recall if it was done in this paper or not. Yeah.
Anything else to advise? Sounds like the passport will be your presentation on what's that, Tom?
So this is getting really close to paper phase.
The path forward sounds like it would be a good presentation on the methods. Is considering using for establishing relative potency factors and the guidance for any issues after that presentation, questions that you want to have answered.
I guess I would ask for very specific kind of questions for the people to try to adjust. Like if you were to apply AC50 data to evaluate relative potency, what would you do? Is that, I would imagine people would actually evaluate for the AC50 or something.
I can't remember, to be honest.
Sorry, but that's the question that we got. I mean, that's the type of specific question that we want to know. Like what we're interested in is deriving relative potency data. And so based upon like the AC50 SID, they've done it. How would that be? I think that's how.
You could know what the biochemical department was narrowed it down to or included in the assays, and if not, what's the process and the timeline for doing that then, so you wouldn't have to rely on survey value actually do that.
The complicating factor with some of them is that they are not commercially available and they're only available from Chemours. And while they have agreed to provide us these reference materials for this exact purpose, we have not gotten to that yet.
And then that's either yes, no, and the other question might be, structurally, what is the surrogate effect?
And ultimately, they have health advisories, chemical, goal to come up with health advisories.
DEQ makes surface and groundwater standards, so we don't do health advisories. Our goal is to have individual surface and/or groundwater standards for the individual PFAS compounds. We are able to utilize the data from mixtures in such that if there is an independent reference dose for PFMOAA and it's 5, and then we have a mixture that shows there is increased toxicity in the mixture with everything else, and that particular dose is 1, then we have the authority to use the dose of 1 from the mixture as the individual surface water groundwater standard. That's how our mixtures authority works. As far as just a mixture of chemicals together, and this is the dose that they're all being regulated as, it's more intricate than that. But I absolutely want mixtures data to apply to our individual standards. So.
We're looking for the expeditiously to get individual water quality standards on water justified for is based on I'm wondering for PFAS, for which we have more information, we could maybe talk about relative potency. Have that order of relative potency been compared to the results? And maybe that would be one way to ground truth some of the you're saying that you had like for gold standard toxicological information for compound X, Y, and Z. Did you also look at how they performed in the high frequency assays and see?
So I can't say that I have done that, but I do believe it has been done. And I know for one of the publications, Gen X was used as a surrogate for the whole class that Gen X is a part of. And so everything in that particular class was given the same potency as Gen X. And that is the class that includes PFMOAA and all the others. And so that's actually part of this group's second publication. And I think that it's an interesting method, and it employs a scientific principle and rationale for doing that, which is essentially just assigning a potency factor of 1 for everything. So I think there's a lot of intricate details with each of these questions, and I think they all have very different answers. If that's a good answer.
Anybody?
This is maybe more of a wrap-up comment, but I think that we just have to keep in perspective that the holy grail of NAMs is being able to use them to derive guideline values. And a lot of people are devoting a lot of thought to that, but it's very much on the forefront of the frontier, and it's very much developing science. So just the thing to never lose sight of with this.
I agree, and I think that it's such an impressive way forward to reduce the use of animals and make toxicology happen a lot faster, but it is very much the forefront of toxicology. And so it's always evolving and changing. And I think the models will get better and more impressive as time goes on.
For the departments to think about through that presentation or presentations that come up next time, will be things short of standard. Think about how important the inductions, as you mentioned, a lot got done without there being, a more formal understanding for this compounds, just in terms of ways to synthesize and communicate mixtures data back to the public. And it was all based on also the potency factors that were out there. So it wasn't easy for regulation, capital R, but it was used for a lot of environmental management. Science guided some conditions, so that might be something to think about as well in terms of the interim steps along the way to the goal. Think of anything else that you'd like to hear from our discussion of the charge questionnaire. Comfortable recommending the department follow those approaches that they've narrowed it down to. Allowed. You have circulated us as charge questions to the PKSD, because that might be helpful to sure that I'm on the mark.
Yeah.
Would help that.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. That's a great idea. Thank you.
We'll be able to do that at the August meeting. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I think we're well ahead of schedule. I'll ask whether we have anybody who has signed up for public comments. If we do, we'll take a break first before we go. So one of the things that's going to happen after I find out if anybody has signed up. So it's enough. With that, then I'll remind people that our next meeting is August 1st. We will be here again. I've enjoyed the opportunity to work together again. Appreciate y'all attending, and once again, appreciate all the hard work that you did soldiering through interim virtual meetings over the last couple of years. Thanks to again to Louise for the logistics of arranging the meeting. And to Franny for the presentations and for working with the departmental leaders to craft the agenda today. With that, I'd like to have a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Safe travels, everybody. We'll see you in a couple of months.